Carry-On Constitution. Chapter 7.
Tim Halloran and his Western System counterpart, Killer Kelloa, and their fleet's crews worked tirelessly to try to unravel the mystery of the deadly pulse. They knew a great deal about the pulse. They knew that the pulse extended into subspace and hyperspace. They knew that the pulse was incredibly complex, deadly in normal space, and harmless in hyperspace. They knew that something in the pulse altered carbon and silicon atoms so much that life was no longer possible, and yet, every other chemical characteristic remained constant. They knew that the pulse traveled at light speed. And they knew that stars or other astronomical bodies did not diminish the pulse. They knew that their combined shields were able to protect the life within the shields. And the last thing they knew was that the pulse was monstrous. This they derived from the time the Constitution and Constellation were gone on the mission to measure the extent of the pulse. Well over 6 months had passed since they had sent David and John on their mission. They were concerned, but not worried. Both captains were highly competent and experienced. Their crews were the best in the system Navy, rivaling the crew of the USS Enterprise, and in some instances, exceeding the skill and dedication of Perry's crew. The two ships arced over the Shapley Center running toward the fleet to report their findings. As they ultralighted over the center of the galaxy, their sensors extended out toward the center monitoring the radiation levels, ensuring that their ships did not stray too far into the highly radioactive cloud. The crew was as alert as they had ever been. Their families and friends were dependent upon their observations to ensure they were not exposed to too much radiation. It was the beginning of the second shift, and David turned the con over to Joel Carson, his second officer. Stella turned the helm over to the second shift helmsman, Carrie Zimmerman, just as David turned toward the turbo lift. He held the lift, and half the bridge crew entered with her. They descended to the nursery level where David and several other officers exited toward the nursery. As David and the others entered the nursery, little Davy came running and leapt into his arms. David swung little Davy onto his shoulders, and father and son walked proudly to the lift. Several other parents and their children entered the lift and descended to the officers' habitat level to join their spouses, each smiling at one another. The entire crew loved and doted on the children. When David and little Davy entered their cabin, Stella had already prepared a delicious, hot meal. The three sat, ate, and talked. Little Davy told his mother and father all about the things he had done during the day. Then came time for father and son to exercise together. After the exercise time, little Davy crawled up onto his mother's lap. David sat close by, and the little family began to read another Dr. Swiss book, One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. About halfway through the book, the comm sounded.
Captain, Carson here. We have an unusual reading on the radiation levels in the Shapley Center.
David answered, Joel, all stop. Call the Constellation and let them know we are stopping. Joel replied.
Aye, aye, sir.
David said, I'm on my way. David kissed his wife and son and headed toward the bridge. As he entered the bridge, Joel shouted.
Captain on the bridge.
David responded, carry on. What do we have, Joel? Commander Carson showed David his readings. There seemed to be a reduction in the radiation levels as they approached the center of the galaxy. John called from the Constellation.
What's going on, Dave?
David replied, John, it seems like we have a radiation field shaped like a donut. What I think is that in the very center, we have little to no radiation. John asked.
Isn't that where we calculated the pulse originated?
David answered, right. I think one of us should investigate, and the other continued to report to Admiral Halloran. One could hear the smile in John's voice.
Dave, I'll just bet that you're itching to see what's in this hole, aren't you?
David chuckled, well, I guess you know me pretty well. Yeah, I want to go in. John responded.
Okay. It's settled. I go. You stay.
David replied, all right, John. Godspeed. And John responded.
Dave, be careful. As soon as I report to the Admiral, I'll be back.
With that, the Constellation ultralighted on to join the fleet. David thought a moment and then turned to the communications officer, ship-wide, please, Mr. Null. The communications officer replied.
Ship-wide aye.
David continued, this is the captain. We have found a hole in the center of the radiation field at the center of our galaxy. This is where I believe the pulse originated. We are going in to investigate. We will be monitoring the radiation levels at all times. If it seems to be getting too hot, we will pull out. Stay alert. Captain out. Slowly and steadily, the great ship descended toward the very heart of the galaxy. Every officer and crewman were watchful for any indication of radiation leaking into the ship. Under normal combat conditions, the radiation would not have been a consideration, but this was not combat as anyone aboard understood. Because of the children, the crew was extra cautious. Nevertheless, it was vital to explore the point of origin of the pulse. David sat riveted to the command chair, watching and listening to every voice, noise, and alarm. He was continually checking the readouts that presented themselves to ensure that the ship and its crew remained safe and secure. David had the ship descending at sublight speed to ensure their safety. At this rate, it would take well over 72 hours to reach their destination. He hated the delays. Every minute meant that the deadly pulse was traveling further and further, possibly engulfing civilizations and annihilating all life in its path, but his ship and crew came first. Hour after hour, they descended toward the heart of the galaxy. Stella and the day crew came on duty, and David had been in the center chair for 36 hours straight. At the end of her shift, she told him to get down to their quarters and get some sleep. Larry Sorensen, David's first officer, stayed on to relieve him, but he refused to be relieved.
Captain, I'll have Captain M. Tao relieve you if I have to. You're no good to us in your present condition.
David snapped, "Are you threatening me, number one?" Larry answered,
No, sir. I am trying to get you to get some sleep. Unless you don't trust me.
David thought for a long time. "All right, you have the con, Larry. But wake me if there is anything unusual, please." The first officer replied.
Aye, sir.
Immediately after the captain left, Larry turned the con over to Joel Carson and descended to his quarters as well. David stumbled to the lift and descended to his cabin. Stella and little Davy greeted him, fed him, then saw that he was in bed as soon as possible. He was asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow. She looked down at her husband and captain, asleep. All the tension was gone from his face, and he looked like a little boy. She and little Davy tiptoed out and shut the door. They snuggled together in a chair, and she read him another of his books, Dr. Swiss, and To Think It Happened on Mulberry Street. After the story, they just snuggled a little, and then she put him to bed and prepared for bed herself. David woke about 6 in the morning, checking his watch. He got up and went into their family room and called the bridge. "Bridge, this is the captain."
Bridge, Commander Kaita here, Captain.
David asked. "Anything unusual, Commander?" The watch officer replied.
No, sir. Everything is very quiet.
Relieved, David said, "Good, thank you, Commander." "Stephen's out." David knew that it would be. He was just very worried that something would harm his ship and crew. The radiation readings remained constant and well within safety limits. The day shift went well, everything was normal and quiet. At shift change, the second officer, Commander Joel Carson, relieved David as usual. David went to the nursery to pick up little Davy. His son rushed to him and began to tell David everything he had done during the day. Other members of the crew were dropping off or picking up their children, and everyone smiled and greeted one another warmly. This ship was proud of their children, and everyone loved all the kids. A lieutenant greeted the captain warmly as they both left the nursery.
Good evening, Captain. Have a good day, Davy.
David returned the greeting. "Marla, I see you, and your little Jenny are well, have a good shift." The two Stevens men entered their quarters to the smell of dinner on the table.
Wash up, you two, dinner is ready.
Both guys responded with a hearty,
Aye, madam.
as they did as they had been instructed. After dinner, the two fellows exercised for a half hour, then Davy crawled into his mother's lap, and David sat close with his arm around Stella. The three picked out another favorite book and began to read The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins by Dr. Swiss. The little family snuggled for a while, then put little Davy to bed and prepared to retire themselves. David had not fully recovered from his extended vigil. David woke. Something was not right. He listened and heard Stella's soft breathing. She was okay. He got out of bed, put on a robe, and went in to check on little Davy. He quietly opened the door and listened. He heard nothing. His heart pounding, he went to the bedside, only to hear Davy roll over in his bed. Davy was okay. Then out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. His head snapped around. but the image was gone. As he turned to leave Davy's room, the image just in view on his extreme right. Again, his head snapped around only to see nothing. Back in the common section of their quarters, David reached the comm station. Bridge, this is the captain.
Bridge, Commander Kaita here, Captain.
David asked, Commander, have you noticed anything unusual? Kiter answered.
No, sir. All is quiet. All system normal.
David replied, Okay, thanks Commander. Captain out. David stood, trying to see what wasn't there. Again, he saw just on the edge of his vision, something. Who is there? Who is there? There was no answer, but again, he saw something. He called the bridge again. Commander, would you see if you can raise Commander Trank, the ship's counselor, and ask her to come to my quarters? Kiter replied.
Aye, sir.
David waited, and in about half an hour, the door annunciator buzzed. David opened the door, and Commander Trank entered.
Is something wrong, Captain?
David stood aside. Please sit a moment, Commander. I have this feeling that something is not right. And I keep seeing something on the edge of my vision. Can you sense anything? The counselor sat quietly for a moment, then.
I sense a curiosity, apprehension, and sadness. But it is not coming from you, your wife, or your son. There is someone else here, sir.
Worried, David asked, is there malice? She replied.
No, sir. Just the curiosity, apprehension, and sadness.
David asked, can they hear me? She answered.
I'm sorry, sir. I can't tell you that. I'm an empath, not a telepath.
David shrugged, of course. Thank you, Commander. I'm sorry to have bothered you. Good night. She answered.
I'm here if you need me. Good night, Captain.
David looked into the darkness. I'm going back to bed. We'll deal with this tomorrow. David sensed a quietness, and so he returned to bed. As David entered the bridge, he called his first officer, number 1. My ready room please. Larry Sorensen, David's first officer, entered the ready room.
What's up, boss?
David answered, Larry, there is a presence on the ship. Commander Trank felt their presence in my cabin last night. Larry asked,
Good, bad, or indifferent, sir?
David responded, can't tell. We need a telepath. You're the first officer. Do we have a telepath in the crew? Larry answered.
We have a Tellurian ensign in the science lab, Ensign Tasser.
David said, let's get her up here, Larry.
Aye, aye, sir.
Larry tapped his comm badge.
Ensign Tasser, this is the first officer. Report to the captain's ready room immediately, please.
After a moment, a soft voice answered.
On my way, sir.
David tapped his comm badge. Commander Trank, this is the captain. Please come to my ready room immediately. Again a moment, then the counselor's voice.
On my way, Captain.
The two officers waited in silence until the door annunciator buzzed. Enter. The two women entered.
Sir.
They said in unison. David turned to Commander Trank. Emily, do you feel the presence here now? She replied.
Yes, sir. The same presence I felt last night.
David asked, Ensign, can you communicate with whatever presence is here? She replied.
I can only try, sir.
With that, Ensign, Tasser closed her eyes and spread her arms and began to chant quietly.
We are a one, we are a one.
Her eyes flew open and in a strange voice began to speak.
Oh, this is marvelous. I can see, I can hear. Oh, I apologize. I sensed you were in charge of this vessel.
David stepped toward Tasser. I am the captain of this ship. Who and what are you?
Well, Captain, I am Sergio Fant. It was also much like you. But there was an accident, and everyone on Aunt became a being of pure energy. Why are you coming to Aunt?
Before David could speak, Sword spoke.
Captain, I sense that this young person is in severe distress. I am separating from her. We need a much stronger individual.
Ensign Tasser looked at her captain.
I apologize, Captain.
And she collapsed into David's arms. She was light and unconscious, so David carried her to sickbay. He explained the situation to Dr. M. Tao and asked the medical crew to care for her and let him know when she was able to talk. Later, David and his first officer were talking in the ready room. Larry said,
Captain, maybe we don't need a telepath. Maybe we only need a willing person to communicate with Sorge. I'm willing to try. I am stronger than Ensign Tausser.
Without hesitation, David agreed to allow Larry to try. Larry just stood and said,
Sorge, I'm willing to try.
Sorge's voice came from Larry's mouth.
This one is stronger, Captain, but not strong enough. Perhaps there is another stronger one?
Larry staggered and sat on the couch.
Oh, my head. This is the worst headache I have ever had. Captain, the strongest crew member is Commander Kiter. Should I call him?
David tapped his comm badge. Lieutenant Tall, please ask Commander Kiter to come to the ready room as soon as possible. Tall answered.
Aye, sir.
About a half hour later, there came a buzz at the door. Enter, boomed the captain.
Commander Kiter reporting as requested, Captain.
David looked at Commander Kiter, at ease. Commander, I'm going to ask a favor of you. You may refuse if you see fit to do so. David told the burly Centurion the events leading up to his being called to the ready room. Commander, you are the strongest member of the crew. Are you willing to allow Sorge to communicate through you? Kiter straightened his shoulders.
I am. Sorge, I am ready.
Sorge's voice came from Kiter's mouth.
This one is indeed strong, but we need another kind of strength. I shall follow along with you, Captain, and try the various individuals you come into contact with. I will only be united with them a very short time unless I find the strength. I need to speak with you.
Kiter sagged as Larry had.
Oh, by the demons of Kelaro, my head is going to explode.
And he sat on the couch as well. David looked at his officers. Thanks for trying. I hope we can find someone with the kind of strength we need to communicate. I don't want to use up the whole crew. You two get some rest. Dismissed. David, Larry, and Kiter stepped out of the ready room to see the second shift relieving the day crew. As they watched, one by one, they seemed to stagger a step, rub their head, and then go to with their duties. Larry looked at David.
I guess he's trying, without success.
David shrugged. That seems to be the case number one. See you later. Get some rest. The three officers stepped into the turbo lift and recited their destination, nursery.
Officers' quarters.
Holographic chamber.
David shot a quick glance at the Centurion. Rest? Kiter smiled.
My daily exercise is rest, Captain.
The captain smiled. Carry on, Commander. The turbo lift stopped at the nursery level, and David strode to the nursery to get little Davy and get them both home. It was easy for the little family to consider the captain's cabin home. Once again, David greeted the other crew members as they collected or deposited their children, returning each smile with one of his own and a wink at each child. Little Davy ran to his father and jumped into his arms, bubbling over with tales of the day's activities. Davy looked at his dad.
Captain, this one has the strength. But I sensei is very precious to you.
David hugged little Davy. You are right, he is very precious. He is my son. However, we may be able to communicate through him if we are very careful. A child is quite fragile. Sorge thought.
I understand.
David said, I need to speak to my son. Davy screwed up his face.
Sorge wants me to help talk to you, Daddy.
David smiled a wan smile at his son. I know, son. How do you feel about that? Davy's face showed a lot of tension.
It's scary.
The boy's father told him, I need to talk to Sorge. But if you're afraid, I guess we will have to try something else. Davy puffed out his chest.
I can try it. Will you always be with me, Daddy?
David assured him. Yes, I will always be with you, my son. Little Davy responded.
Okay. Let's try.
Then David said, let's wait and talk to your mother first. Davy argued.
But Daddy, you're the captain.
David patted Davy's leg. Yes, but your mom needs to be okay with this too. After all, she's the mom, isn't she? Davy responded.
Yeah, she's the mom.
David and Davy entered the cabin to the smell of dinner. Stella looked up.
Get washed up, guys. Dinner is ready.
The two men washed up, and the little family gathered around the table. Davy spoke up.
Mom, Sorge wants me to help him and Daddy talk.
Stella's eyes opened wide.
Who is Sorge?
David explained the situation as best he could, and Sorge found that Davy has the kind of strength needed. Davy thinks he can do it, but I said that you needed to be okay with this too. Davy piped up.
Yeah,
The captain says you're the mom, and you need to be okay with this too.
She looked at her husband.
David, I could handle you doing something dangerous. I could handle me doing something dangerous. But our son, little Davy, no. I couldn't handle that.
There was a long pause, and then she continued.
Sorge, try me.
Stella started and looked at David.
Captain, this one also has the strengths.
David stood. Sorge, try me. Suddenly David was aware that he and Sorge were having a conversation, in his head.
Captain, you three are different from the others I tried. You have the strengths.
David answered, it could be that Stella and I were born over 500 years ago. We were in cryogenic sleep for nearly 500 years, and we passed the strength to our son. Well, at least we can communicate. David sat quietly for several hours, during which time he and Sorge answered the questions both had. It was during their conversation that David found out that these people had probably initiated the pulse that was devastating the galaxy. Their sole intent was to try to communicate with other intelligent beings in the universe, if they existed.
We were once a virulent, vibrant race, but we thought perhaps we were alone in the galaxy and we began to die. We had to do something to reawaken the vitality of our people.
So, what did you do?
We built an extremely powerful transmitter. We intended to transmit a series of mathematical messages into space. If anyone could detect and understand the message, they might respond, and we would know we were not alone in the galaxy.
So, what happened?
When our scientists built the transmitter, they made it so it would only be keyed by a person, not by a machine. I'm not sure why. When the transmitter was keyed, I found that I was no longer in a physical body, yet I was still conscious. I later found out that every bit of life on our planet was so changed as I was.
David thought a question. Every bit of life? Sorge answered.
Every bit of life. We can sense even plant life. Do you think that this has happened to life on the other devastated planets?
David replied, it seems very likely. How do you feel about this mode of existence? Can you interact with the others in this frame of existence? Sorge responded, almost helplessly.
We can only interact in a very superficial way. Most of us wish we could reverse things. We taste nothing, feel nothing, smell nothing, hear nothing. We can only sense what another is thinking. We have stayed this way for thousands of years. We can't even die. We can't do anything physical. I sensed your ship and came out of curiosity. Perhaps you can help us.
David said, I'm exhausted. Sorge answered,
I will leave, rest. We will talk again. I have up again, Captain.
David looked at his watch, 10 o'clock. Stella and Davy were asleep, so he showered and crawled into bed, exhausted.